The following video contains references to suicide, as well as spoilers for the game Celeste. Hi, I'm Jack. You may or may not know me for my music, but this will be my first attempt at a style of essay-centric journalism that has cropped up in spaces around the internet in the past couple years. In writing and creating this, I hope to stumble across a succinct version of what I'm trying to say, and hopefully impact others who have experienced similar things. Today I want to talk about difficulty. Life is difficult, work is difficult, school is difficult, relationships are difficult, and trust is difficult. Writing this without a college education is difficult, sounding smart is difficult, and being entertaining while making a point is difficult. You know what manages to be entertaining while making a point? Video games, which are also, you guessed it, difficult. Well, they can be. It depends on who you are, and it depends on the game. In Celeste, you play a girl named Madeline who's decided against her better judgment to climb the legendary Mount Celeste. There are plenty of videos on what Celeste means, but for our purposes, Celeste is a game about difficulty, or overcoming it for the sake of overcoming it. Madeline is a 25-year-old girl suffering from mental illness and anxiety, and the game follows her arbitrary choice to climb Mount Celeste, a task that is considered to be borderline impossible. Seemingly, she does this just to prove to herself that she can. Celeste is a rare example of a video game that is using the strength of its medium to bolster the points it's trying to make as a piece of storytelling. In other words, the game is hard because coping with and overcoming mental illness is hard, much like climbing a mythical, unclimbable mountain. The game's lead creator, Matt Thorson, used their own struggles with anxiety disorder as an inspiration. Growing up, they used gaming as an escape from their mental illness, and even drew level ideas for Super Mario World in their notebook when they were away from their Super Nintendo. Game design has fundamentally changed since its inception. To make money, early arcade machines had difficult games with limited lives. This ensured that players would need to feed the machines money to learn and master the mechanics. With the invention and popularization of home consoles came the ability to save your progress and try as many times as your heart desired. Limited lives took on a different meaning and needed a new context to justify their existence. Early Mario games did this by rewarding careful gameplay, completionism, and exploration with extra lives, shortcuts, and ultimately increased mastery of the game's mechanics. These continue to be a staple of the series to this day. As technology progressed, it made less and less sense to even include them as a mechanic. Game designers had to find new ways to justify their existence or do away with them entirely, and many chose the latter. Without lives, there were fewer restrictions on what challenges developers could expect their players to complete. Since dying didn't mean starting over from the beginning, they could task their players with radical and seemingly impossible challenges. But this innovation came with its own set of questions. Mainly, in a game with unlimited lives, what does death actually mean? An early game that plays with this question was Braid, a game in which you played a character named Tim trying to rescue a princess. Borrowing story cues and gameplay elements from Super Mario Bros., Braid twisted the genre's conventions by allowing the player to rewind time whenever they wanted. This allowed the game's lead designer, Jonathan Blow, to buck genre staples like collectibles, limited lives, and simple platforming in favor of more complex puzzles and challenges. This game inspired a wave of artsy platformers like Limbo, Fez, and Inside. Super Meat Boy, another game in the modern platformer genre, also gave players unlimited tries as well as extreme difficulty, with more intricate levels than Super Mario Bros. But also more mechanics, like wall jumps and climbing. The game rewarded players with an explosive display of meat and gibs upon level completion, showing all of their thwarted attempts simultaneously. On more difficult stages, this meant seeing hundreds of copies of the player's avatar bounding around the screen, splattering against buzzsaws, falling into pits, being crushed by moving blocks, etc. It incentivized the process of trial and error by showing the fruits of your efforts in a visceral and satisfying way. No longer was dying a sign that you were doing something wrong. It was actually a major part of the game, and whether you died 100 times or 1,000 times, it never felt like a failure, as long as you had the will to try again. 10 years later, we got Celeste. Celeste takes after Meat Boy in many respects, doing away with lives in favor of a limitless trial and error approach. It also lifts the grab and wall jump mechanics directly from said game, but instead of showing you your cumulative deaths visually, it instead incorporates that difficulty into its narrative. Madeline's struggle to climb the mountain is portrayed as hard, so of course the game itself is hard. Whether you die 100 or 1,000 times, it is a given that Madeline is experiencing failure throughout the game. Were you to say, beat the entire game without dying, this would not change, at least not in the dialogue or the overall tone. The game expects you to die many, many, many times. This is reflected in the somber tone of the music, the themes of grief, mental illness, and self-loathing. As you progress through the story, Madeline clashes with her own insecurities in the form of part of her, affectionately known as Badeline in the fan community. You also encounter other lost souls on the mountain struggling with their own demons, and at the end of a stage, the game presents you with a tally of how many deaths you collected during your climb. I say collected because this death counter is treated like most games treat collectibles, such as coins or extra lives. Occasionally, a message displays assuringly, quote, "Be proud of your death count. The more you die, the more you learn. Keep going." As my friends and I played through Celeste, we'd often talk about its themes, its powerful message about mental health, the symbolism, and also its difficulty. There were puzzles in which most of the screen was covered in life-ending spikes, and as the levels went on, the margin for error became smaller and smaller. Late game stages were equal parts oppressive and empowering. To see the challenge ahead could at times be overwhelming, even devastating, but by mastering it and moving on, you felt like there was hope. Not just for Madeline, but for yourself and the challenges you face in your own life, outside of the game. There was a poetic justice to it, seeing this small and powerless climber face these daunting trials. She would get up and try again as long as you were willing to lend a hand. The music, composed by LGBT composer Lena Raine, only added to this feeling. It was beautiful and sad. The gentle piano reminded you of how far you'd come, yet the forlorn melodies reminded you of how delicate Madeline's hope really was. You and Madeline knew that there was always an even more difficult challenge up ahead just beyond the edge of the screen. At times I would clear a stage and have to lie down, breathing heavily with relief and mental exhaustion from the sheer amount of prolonged concentration and effort it took to make it through. This was an extremely hard game for me. At any point in Celeste, you can open Madeline's journal to see your progress in the game, how many levels you have completed, how many of the game's optional strawberries you had found and collected, and of course, how many times you had died. And I remember a familiar feeling of dread when I saw how many more times I died in my Celeste playthrough than my other friends. 20,000 times over roughly 60 hours of gameplay. I was almost embarrassed at the discrepancy between us, the skill gap, how much more time it took me to acquire the skills needed to complete the challenges that they were able to beat on the second or third try. Had they really experienced the same thing that I had? We're taught that willpower is the counterbalance to natural talent, and that some people are naturally gifted, but the rest of us can catch up as long as we try extra hard. This is only sometimes true. I'm going to admit something. I'm not exceptionally talented or smart. Everything I've ever been able to do in my life is the result of me trying extremely hard and not knowing when to quit. Academically, my skill ceiling is generally below average. My memory is absolutely awful, and I have to write everything down in my phone or else I'm going to forget it. I got bad grades through middle and high school while my friends succeeded. I went to college thinking I could correct this by developing healthy habits, only to drop out when I realized that no amount of wanting it was going to raise my memory limit, or increase how much stress I could handle, or make me compatible with the way institutional academics work. We tend to think of it as charitable to believe that others can do better, but for someone like me, the assurance that I could get good grades if I just applied myself made me believe that I wasn't applying myself, which I was. It was just significantly more difficult for me to succeed in those spaces than it was for my friends, as the very mechanics of schooling are tied directly to my trauma. To this day, I have a hard time remembering even short sequences of numbers, like my social security number, for example. So you can imagine that any course that required any kind of memorization was going to be an instant fail for me. Similarly, at some point in my DDR career, I realized that I was never going to be able to complete Max 300 on heavy mode. I developed tendinitis in my feet because of the way they were shaped. Additionally, my lungs just couldn't take the prolonged, intense movement. I almost had to go to the hospital on numerous occasions from extended sessions, thinking that if I only pushed myself a little bit harder, I could be the dance champion that I desperately wanted to be. Much like Madeline's other half, who scolds her for her mistakes early on and abuses her for not being a better climber, I also have a second voice. It's usually just in my head, but sometimes when something is frustrating or traumatic enough, it comes out. It's embarrassing, but it's the same voice as my father yelling at me. I scream at myself to do better, threaten myself with violence if I don't get it right. I've only recently started adjusting this habit, partially because of Celeste's portrayal of negative and positive reinforcement. Now when I catch myself directing abusive language at myself, I at least try to say things like, "You can do it, I have faith in you," instead of, "I'm going to kill you if you don't get it right this time." I believe my friends when they say it was hard for them to complete Celeste, even when it only took them 100 tries to beat a level. Same as I believe them when they say college was hard, or that going through a breakup was hard, or that losing their parent was hard. But I think it must be said, trying something 100 times in Celeste never felt hard to me. It felt necessary or expected. My threshold for what I considered to be difficult was probably much higher than theirs, and this is not due to being skilled, it's actually quite the opposite. In a given situation, when everything is a struggle, in a way, nothing feels like a struggle. Even among groups of people who are suffering from similar things, we underestimate just how much of a spectrum difficulty can cover. For some people, hard means trying 100 times and succeeding once, but in a very literal sense, for me, hard means trying 1,000 times and succeeding once. Experiences with difficulty can vary from person to person, and phrases like, "it's a struggle," "this is painful," "that was traumatic," "it's difficult," and even "I'm nervous" can mean profoundly different things to different people. Even in conversations where it feels as though we are relating to the same thing, there's an invisible barrier of communication. People live through the exact same circumstance and come away with significantly different levels of negative and positive emotions. And in a world where brevity is rewarded with attention, we always use the most extreme and least nuanced version of our words to explain how we feel about something, which gives people who actually do feel the most extreme versions of things very little to work with. How many times have you read something described as amazing, profound, intense, the dark souls of blank, the scariest movie of all time, the best album I've ever heard, the most delicious, this ruined my childhood, I literally want to kill myself? In modern capitalism, this is the default method of getting your attention, and unfortunately, this means words that were created to convey the most extreme descriptions are now relatively meaningless. Is it hard for you to fall asleep at night? Is it hard for you to take basic measures to take care of yourself, like preparing meals or cleaning your room? Is it hard to get up in the morning, brush your teeth, shower, eat? Is it hard to trust people? Is it hard to know when you're wanted? Is it hard not to cry, or is it hard to even cry at all? There are people who struggle with invisible difficulty modifiers every day. Gender dysphoria, repressed shame, living in the closet, learning disabilities, post-traumatic stress disorder, drug addiction. Some of us are parentless, partnerless, jobless. These modifiers often cluster and stack and are weighed against an individual's own tolerance for struggle. I think it's easy to interpret the protagonist of Celeste, Madeline, as someone with many stacked modifiers, struggling to defeat challenges inside and outside of herself simultaneously. Some of us are juggling problems or playing with broken controllers, living with undiagnosed mental illnesses, and we don't even know it. I didn't know my metaphorical controller was broken until I started seeing a therapist and started treating my mental illness with medication. Without the context of my circumstantial modifiers, i.e. being queer, growing up in an abusive situation, being neurodivergent, I had never given myself permission to fail, and without permission to fail, I could never truly succeed at anything. I think we need to learn how to talk about our struggles and empathize with each other better. We are alarmingly quick to reward and withdraw empathy based on new knowledge of who we are dealing with. That's why I choose to use language like modifier to describe the persistent individual struggles that we deal with. I borrow the term from Peter Coffin, but in this case, I think of it in tabletop gaming terms, with a modifier being something that adds or subtracts from the total value of a dice roll. There are certain modifiers that make seemingly mundane things remarkably difficult for me. For example, many months ago I had to quit Twitter and most other forms of social media because if I see the wrong thing, I can have a full-on panic attack and lose the rest of my day. This decision came long after I tried many browser plugins designed to filter usernames and keywords. No matter how many keywords I added, something would slip through the cracks and I would end up at rock bottom again. If I open that website and roll the dice, I'm going to roll a 1 every single time, no matter what I do. Critical failure. I still post and I still check my notifications, but even the handful of times I've been tempted by the timeline have led me to panic attacks. Do I think I have it harder than you? Well, on Twitter I probably do, but that's not really the point that I'm getting at. It was hard for me to beat Celeste, and I'm someone who grew up playing a lot of the video games that inspired it. That was me at an advantage. Years of preparation, and I still describe it as hard. My friend Dave, despite beating it in roughly 1/10 of the time it took me, and dying only a small fraction of the times that I did, still uses the same word that I do, hard. But I have friends who hadn't even been able to play video games until the Nintendo Switch arrived in 2017 due to their own physical limitations, because earlier consoles' controllers weren't designed for their differently abled hands. The smaller Joy-Cons were easier to hold and manipulate for them and opened the door to gaming as a hobby for the first time in their lives. I guess what I'm saying is, I don't know what word someone with that level of difficulty is supposed to use. For you, getting up in the morning might be like dying 100 times and getting it right once, but for someone else, that number can be so much higher, and their tolerance for failure and pain can be so high that in conversation, even if you were using the same words, neither of you would see the difference. The difference is invisible. You might take for granted how much harder things can be, and they might take for granted how much easier things are for you, because you're likely using the same language to describe your respective situations. What's more, there are people who, on paper, have an easier life than you or I, but still feel their struggles harder than we do, which can lead them down a path of drug addiction or suicide. The things that traumatized me are likely not as bad as what most of you have been through, but I can't argue with my biology. I can't argue with my brain's hard-coded decision that anything that reminds me of my trauma is critical and life-threatening. I can't tell my brain that suicide is unreasonable. Life does not have a death counter the way that Celeste does. You can't just look up how much harder it is for you to get out of bed than it is for someone else. You can't just compare pain tolerance either. But if you can imagine it, try to understand that some of us spend every day dying 1,000 times for your every 100. Even people we don't like, even people who are lucky, even people who have it better than us. Again, I don't view suffering as a competition, quite the contrary. I see it as an invisible barrier that prevents people from living the happiest version of their lives, and all I want to do is help others see that. The song you're listening to right now allowed me to pay this month's rent. I wish I was as good at relationships, holding a job, or even being a good person as I am at making music. I use my phone to help me remember things, I write my ideas down, I drink caffeine, I take Wellbutrin and sertraline for my depression and anxiety. I distract myself when the bad thoughts linger, and I cope as best as I can. But this does not put me on the same footing as someone who doesn't have my modifiers. I think we put too much emphasis on the idea that we can all have equal abilities if we try hard enough, that labor alone can give us equality. We may be operating on equal levels, we may even achieve the same ends, but we will never have an equal experience. Even if we end up in the same place, in the same tax bracket, at the same college, on the same stage, in the real world we don't see the difference between our journeys, all we see is the results. I rely on hyperfixation to overcome many things that are just above my skill ceiling. For everything else, I greatly rely on my friends, not just for advice and help, but for warmth and company. Probably more than your average person. I am the kind of person who needs a lot of direct communication and assurance from the people around me. I get attached and confused easily. There are millions of people with the same modifiers as me, who aren't so lucky to have a niche skill that pays their bills. Millions of people are coping in hard mode, juggling a full-time job, a family, school, along with all the issues I just listed. Some of them are even doing it with a lower tolerance for pain than I have. Again, suffering isn't and shouldn't be a competition. If anything, we should be competing to help one another, gamifying the process of healing each other, building communities around the very idea. After all, none of us can climb the mountain alone. Sometimes it takes an extra set of hands to lift us up and another to push us forward. Thank you for watching. If you liked this video, please leave a comment. I guess that's how this works. If you want my video to end up in the algorithm and get seen by other people, and share it. And if you like this essay format, let me know and leave a comment with some ideas for other videos I might want to make. Sharing this was very hard, and I just appreciate anyone who managed to sit through the entire 18 minutes of it. I'll see you next time. Also, like and subscribe and smash that bell button. I'm gonna try to make more videos. Bye.